the godmother, the Black Widow, Queen Pin. The infamous Griselda Blanco went by many aliases and nicknames as the leader of a blood-soaked billion-dollar drug empire spanning from Colombia to the United States. Blanco's life, which is currently the subject of the Netflix series called Griselda, aired on the side of fiction as she battled to rise to power in a violent world. So who is the real woman behind the myth? On February 15, 1943, Blanco was born in Colombia. The popular politician Jorge Eliezer Gaitan was slain on April 9, 1948 in Bogotá, sparking the start of La Violencia, a period of widespread violence and unrest that would soon tear apart Griselda's homeland. A decade later, La Violencia came to an end, but not before 200,000 people had been killed. It was against this violent setting that Blanco came of age. In Women Drug Traffickers, historian Elaine Carey noted that Blanco and her peers discovered that power frequently came through violent acts. In Medellin, Blanco was raised in poverty and didn't have much influence at first. At the age of 11, she supposedly started her career in crime when she abducted a local boy and killed him when her attempt at ransoming him failed. She expanded her resume to include pickpocketing and counterfeiting in the years that followed. Carlos Trujillo, who made a profession by forging documents and trafficking people, was the man Blanco eventually met and married. 3 children were born into the marriage, however it ended in divorce. Trujillo had passed away by the middle of the 1970s. Some argue that Trujillo's death was caused by health problems, while others believe Blanco was the real culprit. The 1970s disco boom created a growing demand for illegal substances like cocaine. Colombia became the epicenter of the cocaine trade by the middle of the decade, bringing with it both tremendous profit and risk. Griselda built a cocaine empire based in New York, with Alberto Bravo, a drug smuggler and Blanco's second husband. To transfer drugs across international borders, they depended on smugglers who wore specially made undergarments. Blanco's and Bravo's relationship worsened as the empire evolved. Bravo was assassinated in 1975, yet the exact details of what happened are still up for debate. As time went on, Blanco said that she shot him in the mouth herself. Bravo's death solidified Griselda Blanco's reputation as the Black Widow, a woman who murdered her husbands to get rid of them. During its height, Blanco's network pushed $80 million worth of cocaine every month. Los Angeles, Miami, and New York were her 3 largest markets. Blanco became known as the Godmother, Colombia's version of Vito Corleone from The Godfather, thanks to her cocaine business. In 1978, she gave birth to her 4th and last child, whom she named Michael Corleone in homage to the main character in the movie. The cornerstone Blanco used to establish and sustain her power was violence. It was the oil that kept the engine of her network running, and it turned Miami into a drug war battlefield. On July 11, 1979, one of the most well-known attacks took place. In a liquor store in Miami's Dodland Mall, 2 men shot and killed a cocaine dealer and his bodyguard, most likely at Blanco's request. In another Miami incident in 1982, Blanco orchestrated a hit on her associate Jesus Castro after he allegedly kicked one of her children. However, when her hitmen tried to carry out the job, they accidentally killed Castro's 2-year-old son Johnny in the process. One of her assassins, Jorge Ayala, claimed that Blanco rejoiced at the mistake. At first she was real mad because we missed the father. But when she heard we had gotten the son by accident, she said she was glad that they were even. The children of Blanco personally witnessed violence. She likely gave the order for Dario Sepulveda, her 3rd husband, to be killed in 1983. In Colombia, he was slain in front of their 5-year-old son, Michael Corleone. Authorities believe Blanco was involved in at least 40 killings across the United States. For a while at least, Blanco was able to stay one step ahead of the law. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration recruited informants to locate her and compile evidence against her for a case. She was taken into custody on February 17, 1985, in Irvine, California, and following a trial she was given a 15-year prison sentence. 9 years later, additional charges came, this time regarding the deaths of drug dealers Alfredo and Grisel Lorenzo, as well as Johnny Castro. After being deported to Colombia in 2004, Blanco spent 8 years living quietly in El Poblado, the wealthiest neighborhood of Medellin. On September 3, 2012, 69-year-old Griselda Blanco stepped outside a butcher's shop in Medellin. 2 shots were fired out of nowhere. The shooters were on a motorcycle and they had sped off. Blanco collapsed. Ultimately, the woman who had carved a treacherous path out of the impoverishment of Medellín's streets perished on them. But what about her 4 sons? What happened to them? Before her inevitable arrest and conviction, Michael Corleone Blanco, Uber, Osvaldo, and Dixon, whom she recruited into her cartel, lived opulent lives off the proceeds of the cocaine trade. According to the Miami News-Times, Blanco's 3 oldest sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo, are all dead, and CBS News has corroborated that at least 2 of them were murdered. Michael, Blanco's youngest child, is still living. He currently owns and operates the lifestyle brand Pure Blanco. He was a cast member of the VH1 reality series Cartel Crew. Currently, he and his wife Marie are suing Netflix and the Griselda creators, alleging that the show is based on tape talks Michael had with producers for which he was not paid. Netflix, as we've alleged, is using these ideas that were part of interviews that were memorialized and writings and notes. Nobody else could have those ideas, and nobody else could have those stories. Michael has stated, adding that he believes the show has misrepresented his mother and misappropriated his family's story. 2 Indian sisters, Seema Gavit and Renuka Shinde, rose to prominence in the 1990s after being linked to a string of abductions and killings. The pair, who hailed from a family of criminals, started out as juvenile offenders and rose to become the most feared criminals in their community. In the early 1970s, Seema and Renuka were born in a small village in Maharashtra, India. Their mother was left to raise the girls by herself because their father, a well-known crook, was frequently in and out of jail. The sisters were exposed to a life of crime as children and picked up the skills of the profession fast. Seema and Renuka's criminal career began in their teenage years when they started to assist their father in his criminal activities. The first turning point was when the sisters snatched a purse at Chatushringi Temple in Pune in April 1990, and the second was an accidental encounter in a market in Nashik in October 1996. However, it was after their father's death that the sisters really began to make a name for themselves. They soon became involved in kidnapping and murder, and were responsible for the deaths of at least 13 children. Their approach was simple. They would abduct little children from the streets, take them to a remote area, and strangle them to death. Their bodies would then be dumped in adjacent fields or rivers. Because the sisters planned carefully and methodically, they were able to avoid the police for years. After one of their victims was able to escape and report the incident, Seema and Renuka were eventually taken into custody in 1996. The sisters were ultimately found guilty and given a life sentence after the authorities were able to connect them to multiple additional kidnappings and deaths. After their arrest and conviction, Seema and Renuka were sent to separate prisons in different parts of Maharashtra. In prison, they both became model prisoners, and they even earned college degrees through a distance learning program. The case of Seema and Renuka is frequently used to illustrate how the Indian criminal justice system has failed. Even though the sisters were well known to the authorities, they were able to carry out their illegal activities without worrying about getting arrested. They weren't taken into custody until after they made an error. Their case also highlights the problem of poverty in India. Many of their victims were from poor families, who were unable to provide adequate protection for their children. It is believed that the sisters targeted these children because they knew that they would not be missed. There are pretty gruesome details to their crimes, but I didn't want to go into too much of them because their victims were children. K.D Kempamma, also known as Cyanide Mallika, was born in Karnataka, India, in 1964. She was young when she got married and moved to Kerala with her husband, who worked for the railways. Kempamma started working as a domestic helper and was stealing from the places she worked at. She served 1 year in prison because of a theft. Once she came out of the prison, Kempamma embarked on her bloody journey. The public became alarmed in the second half of 2007 after several women died in mysterious ways in Bengaluru's suburbs, mostly in locations connected to temples. Oddly enough, there were no wounds on the bodies or indications of an attack. The police had very little luck in solving the case because there were no leads and the majority of the remains were recovered in a decayed state. Cyanide found her distressed, vulnerable, wealthy victims at temples. These women usually had no children and experienced marital or family problems. Kempamma was a middle-aged, kind-looking woman who would quickly win their trust by promising them a solution through a special prayer. She would invite them to attend the ritual wearing their finest attire and jewelry. Then she would lead them to a secluded area. Once there, Cyanide would start the puja. She would ask her victims to close their eyes, forcibly pushing cyanide powder mixed with either food or drink into their mouths. Senior advocate Pinky Anand wrote in her book, Trials of Truth, India's landmark criminal cases. She would take off with the money, jewelry, and other valuables as soon as the victims passed out. The killings by cyanide continued from 1999 to 2007. After each crime, she changed her name to avoid being apprehended by police. A 30-year-old wealthy woman in Bengaluru was her first known victim, and she went on to murder at least 5 more people. In 2008, reports appeared in The Hindu and The Times of India, linking Kempamma to a 7th murder. When cyanide killed Renuka, a resident of Bengaluru, in 2006, the police found her body in a guest house. They followed clues that led them to Cyanide, who went by the name Jayama. She moved on to her next target, a childless Nagveni, as the police were attempting to capture her. Nagveni was summoned by Cyanide for a spiritual ceremony, forced to drink the poison by the same name, and then disappeared with her jewelry. When they apprehended her, the cops discovered the jewelry on her. Cyanide Mallika was found guilty in 2012 and given the death penalty. However, the sentence was later reduced to life in prison. Mary Ann Duignan was born in Ireland in 1871. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Chicago May was among the most notorious Irish foreign criminals to operate in the United States. Before turning 20, May fled her family using the life savings of her parents. She went to Liverpool and used her stolen money to purchase a ticket to the United States. Duignan made that transatlantic trip in luxury, using her stolen gains to travel first class. After a stop in New York, Duignan made her way to Nebraska, where she met and married Dal Churchill, who gave her a lot of advice and taught her skills that would come in handy throughout the course of her lengthy career. When Mr. Churchill was killed, she moved to Chicago, assuming the nickname Chicago May. The excitement of the 1893 World's Fair was palpable throughout the city. The exhibition could not live up to its promise of reviving a region beset by extreme unemployment and homelessness by bringing new jobs and vitality. When 100 jobs were advertised for women at the World's Fair, 10,000 applicants responded. It was a case of necessity outweighing opportunity. May turned to sex work to make ends meet, just like a lot of women in the city. She preferred to call herself a badger, a con woman who entices her victim with sex, then robs him before she has to complete her part of the bargain. She eventually found her way back to New York, where she worked as a chorus girl and kept up her badgering, along with adding blackmailing to her scam list. Though her talents at badgering and blackmailing continued to develop, there aren't many references to her talent on the chorus line. Using compromising letters or photographs, victims made substantial and repeated payments to avoid exposure, or the threatened wrath of her fictitious, enraged husband. She managed to work her con in both North and South America. She was able to live a luxurious lifestyle because of these cons. One article described her as a girl whose diamond rings were as big as hickory nuts. For years, she used charm or bribery to get around the city. However skilled the thief may be, it is important to know when to call it quits. When the police drew too near, Chicago May realized it was her time to go and fled to Europe. In London, she met Eddie Guerin. They robbed an American Express office in Paris together. Though she managed to get to London before being arrested, she loyally, if stupidly, returned to France, and for her trouble, she received 5 years in Montpellier prison. However, she was not imprisoned for very long. Halfway through her sentence, May seduced and blackmailed the prison doctor into signing a medical certificate for her release. She found herself back in court after an attempt on Guerin's life, resulting in another stint in prison. After her release, May moved on with her life. She struck up a relationship with a man known as Charlie Smith. Unsurprisingly, Eddie Guerin was not too pleased about May and Smith's relationship when he escaped from a French penal colony and arrived back in London in 1907. However, before Guerin can take his vengeance, he was shot by Smith. Both Smith and May are immediately arrested. The shooting took place in broad daylight in Russell Square in front of 2 uniformed police officers. May went on to be sentenced to 15 years hard labor for attempted murder, serving 10 years of the sentence before her deportation to the United States. Though May eventually went back to America, it wasn't the glamorous life she'd known. In poor health and suffering from alcoholism, she experienced indifferent success and frequent scrapes with the law. She died in 1929 following complications from surgery.